Our next speaker has been a heroine in the United States for many decades. Marian Wright Edelman is a veteran of the Civil Rights Movement, where she worked with Dr. Martin Luther King. And then following that, she created and ran and runs the Children's Defense Fund, which is a champion for children's rights and has been for many decades. She's also the recipient of the President's Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor our nation can bestow. So we're in for a great treat here this afternoon. It's my great privilege to present Marian Wright Edelman.
Well, Barry. Well, I love being with women who are determined to change the world, so I'm delighted to be here with you, and I want to thank Manaz and WLP for their terrific and persistent work. And one of the first things about movement building is perseverance, because movements take a long time to build. And it takes lots of different seeds, and you never know which ones are going to sprout. But the women's movement has been going on for over a century. The civil rights movement did not start when you saw it in the 60s, and we debate much among ourselves about when did the real civil rights movement start in America. And some will say with the 1954 Supreme Court decision, some will say in 1960 with the sit-in movement, which probably had the greatest immediate impact in opening up, undoing Jim Crow and public accommodations in the South. Some will say the 1963 March on Washington, but movements again come in layers. In fact, I like to think about it like an artichoke. You keep peeling back layers. And so they take a long time if you're talking about, as we are, transforming movements that change the paradigm of how we function. And so be patient, be determined, persevere, and keep planting your seeds. You never know which ones are going to sprout. And it takes engaging lots of people with different skills, and they must be cross-racial and interfaith and intergenerational. And people tend to forget that children were the frontline soldiers of the civil rights movement. And it doesn't take a whole lot of people. All the people who marched for Dr. King, or say they marched for Dr. King, really didn't march for Dr. King. I've always felt so lucky to have been born who I was when I was, at the convergence of great historical events and great leaders. It was an unusual, again, convergence of things that happened after 2 world wars, and soldiers from America, black soldiers from America, went off to fight for freedom that they could not enjoy at home. And that was a set of the very big seeds that got sown. I mean, unemployment among blacks at home, again, emerged with the freedom, with the Nathan Randolph, who the first March on Washington threat was many years before the actual March on Washington threat. And there's an apocryphal story that's told, many people, I think it is true, that A. Philip Randolph, aided and abetted by Eleanor Roosevelt, went to see the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, who was perceived as sympathetic, and told him about the conditions of blacks who had fought for freedom and could not get a decent job and faced all this terrible discrimination in their country, and told him what needed to be done. And the President, who was very sympathetic and listened very quietly, said, "Bill, I agree with absolutely everything that you said. Now you go out and make me do it." Because again, I think that movements require strong outside voices, good inside voices, but nobody's going to do you any favors. Even when they're your friends, you have to build that outside voice. And so what you're attending to is terribly important. I think this is a very difficult and complicated time. We have come a very long ways in the United States. Who would have thought that legal apartheid would crumble in such a short period of time? And who would have thought that these frontline soldiers, who were children, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-year-old children who were the school desegregation plaintiffs, black parents wanted their children to have a better life. And they knew that education was absolutely the key to that. And so these poor parents got a group of poor lawyers to plot a brilliant legal strategy to undermine apartheid. And it was a very brilliant legal strategy, and we all know about Thurgood Marshall, but Charlie Houston was really the great, great unsung hero who was Thurgood Marshall's mentor and was taught at Harvard Law School. Was one of the top graduates of Harvard Law School in the early era, but he and a small band of lawyers who worked for the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund that I had the privilege to be trained by sat and planned a multi-decade strategy to undermine legal apartheid in America. And they picked the best targets. They started off with grossly inequitable facilities and higher education and law schools, but it was a very carefully crafted legal strategy that went on over many decades that culminated in Brown versus Board of Education that was facilitated by poor parents in 5 or 6 districts with their children. And then we saw that you can have the Declaration of Rights, but if there are not clear enforcement mechanisms, and one of the worst, vaguest terms you could ever imagine is with all deliberate speed. And the South took this as an opportunity to mobilize and to resist. So getting access to rights or having rights declared is not the same as getting those rights. And we all know what an extraordinary struggle it was to enforce the law and to get children to actually sit in desegregated situations, and how much violence came by and how many constant returns to the courts to enforce the original rights articulated in Brown, and this incredible courage and spectacle of little Ruby Bridges, 6 years old. You should have her come and talk to you sometimes, who walked through mobs. I was at Central High School about 3 weeks ago, and just imagine this little girl in Louisiana and the Little Rock Nine walking through these mobs of people. But she was 6, and she sat in a class all by herself for a whole year in Little Rock, heckled. And there's a wonderful children's book story that we teach to all the children and young people that we're trying to help become movement builders, to let them know what children did and what young people did, because they really were the frontline soldiers. And Ruby was in the middle of the crowds one day. She stopped, and her teacher, and there was only one white teacher, a few white teachers would stay, as this child came as a lone person in their classroom. And she said, "Ruby, why in the world did you stop in the middle of this heckling crowd?" And she said, "Well, I forgot to pray for them." This kind of spiritual grounding was absolutely key to the kind of ability to kind of keep going. And I cannot tell you enough about the courage of many of my plaintiffs in school desegregation cases who went through losing their homes and being firebombed. And I have in my office, I keep there the little plaque, because you always wanted to have multiple plaintiffs, because you knew that if you had 5, they might likely disappear, or you may be left with 1, and then they would, threaten that one. And so you always wanted to get a bunch of plaintiffs on the assumption you would lose 50% or 75%. And they would post their names up on the telegram post in our rural Mississippi and South Carolina districts, and the next day, they'd disappear. But incredible courage that it took to try to get their children an equal education, and then to see those children sit as the only black child in the classroom year after year, heckled and heckled. And my last act in Mississippi, one of my last acts in Mississippi, was to end so-called freedom of choice, which became one of the middle-level grounds for slowing down desegregation. And we were able to end that because of the courage of a wonderful, great woman who had 9 or 10 children, Ms. May Bertha Carter, sharecropper, and her first children had gone back to stay poor and work in the fields on the plantations, but she didn't want her 6 younger children to go through that. And she came to us to say, "I want my children to have a better life, and I want to challenge this sham." And so she exercised her freedom of choice. She was a very best friend of Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, whom many people have heard of. She won. She got kicked off her plantation. The children got, it's just a horrible life. But they sat in those classrooms for years. Every one of those children finished high school. They all went on off to the University of Mississippi. They are all professionals. But then I'm going to tell you the bad side of it is, and I will come back to that before I end, is that after this generation of her children desegregating the schools and becoming professionals and finishing universities, her grandson is sitting up in prison in Mississippi, and we'll just tell you, movements never get to stay. You've got to constantly keep the clock from turning back.